In the waning light of a cold December afternoon, the sprawling Virginia estate lay shrouded in a quiet that belied the violence simmering beneath its surface. The main house, grand and imposing, with its towering columns and polished wooden floors, reflected the wealth and power of the family that owned it. From a distance, it could have been mistaken for a sanctuary of refinement and tradition, a place where celebrations and laughter marked the passing of each holiday. But closer inspection revealed the harsh reality. The estate was a fortress built upon chains, blood, and the relentless labor of those whose names history often forgot. The enslaved men and women moved through the grounds with practiced silence, their hands calloused, their faces etched with exhaustion, and their eyes carrying a weight that no amount of forced cheer could hide. Each corner of the plantation, the fields stretching endlessly, the barns, the smokehouse, was marked by toil and fear, a daily reminder of a life stolen before it could even begin. Even the winter light seemed to bend differently across the land where slavery ruled. While snow or frost might have softened the edges of the estate for the wealthy family, for the enslaved, it was another obstacle in a world of relentless hardship. Children, barely old enough to comprehend their stolen freedom, moved alongside older men and women who bore not only the physical marks of whippings and harsh labor, but the psychological scars of oppression. Generations of families were held in bondage, their stories largely untold, their pain dismissed as inconsequential in the grand narrative of colonial prosperity. And yet, beneath the surface of obedience and resignation, there was a current of quiet defiance, of minds that refused to surrender completely to the crushing weight of enslavement. The estate itself was a stage upon which contrasting lives played out in stark relief. The family that lived in the mansion had its own rituals, preparing for a Christmas that promised opulence and warmth. Rooms were adorned with fragrant evergreens, tables laden with meats, breads, and sweet treats, and fires roared in hearths meant to chase away the cold. Outside, the enslaved labored endlessly to ensure that this display of wealth went uninterrupted. The preparation was grueling: fields to harvest, barns to clean, animals to tend, and kitchens to maintain, all under the unrelenting gaze of overseers armed with whips and a cruel insistence on obedience. The contrast could not have been more pronounced, the laughter and music of the family juxtaposed against the weary, silent, and sometimes desperate movements of those who sustained their luxury. Despite the oppression, moments of humanity persisted in hidden corners. Enslaved families stole moments to teach their children songs passed down from Africa, whispered stories of distant lands, and shared clandestine prayers and hopes for freedom. Even under surveillance, tiny acts of resistance, the way a hand might linger on a tool to slow production, a glance shared between comrades, a coded phrase passed along like a lifeline, kept the spirit alive. These small rebellions, imperceptible to the family, wove a tapestry of resilience, a quiet undercurrent of defiance that would one day erupt into something far more visible and violent. It was in these moments, as the wind blew across frozen fields and the sun dipped behind leafless trees, that the enslaved could imagine a life unshackled, where their worth was measured not in labor extracted, but in the content of their own lives. Historical records of the time often overlooked the personal stories of those who suffered and resisted. Accounts emphasized the wealth of the family, the size of their harvests, and the efficiency of their operations, while the humanity of those forced into labor was reduced to numbers, hands, bodies, fields worked. But beneath the bureaucratic documentation existed the pulse of life that refused to be erased. Each enslaved individual had their own fears, dreams, and grudges, shaped by years of cruelty, yet nourished by hope, however fragile. The very architecture of the estate, from its high fences to the lockable gates, reflected the need for control, yet it could never entirely suppress the quiet rage and cleverness of those who had nothing left to lose. As the December days shortened and the nights grew long, whispers of discontent traveled from cabin to cabin. Stories of other uprisings, some distant, others closer to neighboring plantations, filtered through the enslaved communities. These accounts, often exaggerated by rumor but grounded in truth, became both warnings and inspiration. They reminded the oppressed that resistance, while dangerous, was possible. And while outwardly they bent to the will of their overseers, inwardly, a storm of plotting, of careful observation, and of patient calculation began to form. The enslaved studied patterns, noted the habits of their masters, and silently identified weaknesses that, if exploited, could overturn the delicate balance of power. Even in the seeming stillness of the estate, shadows moved differently among those who toiled unseen. A glance between two men in the field, the subtle passing of a tool that could serve as a weapon, or a seemingly casual comment that carried a coded meaning. All were pieces of a larger puzzle. The enslaved, despite generations of oppression, demonstrated intelligence, courage, and an almost uncanny ability to adapt to impossible circumstances. Their minds, always alert, calculated risks and imagined possibilities that the family in the mansion could never fathom. It was in this interplay of visible dominance and hidden defiance that the story of the Christmas rebellion would find its roots, a rebellion born not from sudden impulse, but from long-simmering resentment and meticulous planning, nurtured in the shadows of one of Virginia's most imposing plantations. By the time the first chill of Christmas approached, the stage had been set. The grandeur of the estate, the illusion of peace, and the weight of centuries of cruelty created a stark contrast to the hidden world of plotting and hope simmering just out of sight. The enslaved, though seemingly compliant, had begun to imagine a night where their suffering would erupt into fire and action, where the oppressive calm of the plantation could be shattered forever. And it was in this delicate balance of terror, anticipation, and suppressed fury that the story would unfold, a tale both horrifying and awe-inspiring, demanding to be remembered. Life on the plantation was a relentless rhythm of labor and suffering, measured not by the passage of seasons, but by the whims of those who claimed ownership over human lives. From the first light of dawn, the enslaved were roused from their meager quarters, bodies stiff from the cold, hands blistered from endless toil, and spirits weighed down by fear. Fields stretched endlessly before them, heavy with crops that promised wealth for the family above and hunger, exhaustion, and brutality for those who harvested them. Overseers moved like shadows of judgment, their whips cracking against the air, not always needing flesh to enforce terror. A glance, a shouted command, the knowledge that punishment could come at any moment. It was a psychological battlefield, as oppressive as the physical labor itself. Yet, in the midst of this suffocating oppression, small pockets of resistance began to take shape. Whispers that carried ideas too dangerous to speak openly, thoughts of revolt that could be lethal if discovered. The enslaved were not a monolith, but a tapestry of individuals with varied skills, temperaments, and life stories, each carrying personal grievances and fears. Some had been on the plantation for decades, their memories stretching back to freedom long lost. Others had been brought in chains from distant lands, unfamiliar with the local language but keenly aware of the injustice inflicted upon them. Among them were men and women who, despite constant surveillance, found ways to communicate secretly. A shift of the head, a barely audible word, a routine action repeated at precise moments, all became codes in a silent language of planning. They studied the routines of their oppressors meticulously, when the overseers took breaks, when the gates were less watched, when the family slept deeply in their secure mansion. These observations, painstakingly recorded in memory, became the blueprints for rebellion, drawn not on paper but in minds sharpened by necessity. Beyond the physical labor, the psychological toll was immense. Families were separated, bonds severed, and children torn from parents with little warning. The knowledge that a single misstep could result in death or further punishment created a constant undercurrent of terror. But within that terror, there was also ingenuity. The enslaved learned to manipulate small freedoms, turning chores into moments to exchange news, plan, and inspire one another. A laundry basket left behind at the right time, a hidden note in the cornfields, even the placement of tools could communicate intent. Every small act, though seemingly insignificant, became a thread in the fabric of a larger plan. And with each passing day, the desire for freedom grew, fueled not only by desperation, but by an acute awareness of their own humanity in a world determined to deny it. Among these individuals, certain figures emerged as natural leaders. They were not born heroes, but circumstances honed their courage and sharpened their minds. Some had experienced cruelty at the hands of the family or overseers that lit an unquenchable fire of vengeance. Others had witnessed distant uprisings, hearing stories of defiance that ignited hope. Their leadership was not formal, nor could it ever be, for any sign of organization could mean immediate death. Instead, it manifested in quiet authority, a word here, a glance there, gestures that commanded attention and inspired trust. These leaders began to map the estate in their minds, considering every door, every window, every weak point in the defenses that had kept them imprisoned for generations. But plotting rebellion in such a controlled environment was fraught with peril. The consequences of discovery were severe, and the enslaved understood the full weight of that risk. Punishments were public and brutal: whippings, mutilations, and sometimes executions designed to instill fear in everyone who dared even to dream of defiance. And yet, this fear was intertwined with a growing audacity. Each act of observation, each whispered word, each coded signal became an assertion of autonomy, a refusal to be entirely broken. The enslaved began to see that patience, careful planning, and strategic timing were their allies. The Christmas season, a time when the masters were distracted with celebration, offered a unique opportunity, a narrow window where the imbalance of power could be temporarily leveraged. Secret meetings were held in barns, behind fences, or under the cover of darkness, places where the gaze of the overseers could not reach. These gatherings were tense, charged with both fear and determination. Every plan was weighed against potential outcomes, every participant assessed for loyalty and courage. The discussions were punctuated by cautionary reminders. One betrayal, one slip of the tongue, and the consequences would be swift and deadly. And yet, the intensity of these exchanges only strengthened resolve. Bonds were forged in fear and in hope, a silent camaraderie built on the shared desire for liberation. Even as the enslaved plotted, they understood that rebellion was not just about immediate survival. It was about reclaiming dignity, about asserting that their lives mattered beyond the labor extracted from them. The psychological courage required was immense. The act of defiance, even in thought, was revolutionary. The whispers of escape, the secret exchanges, the calculated observations, they all became acts of rebellion in themselves, tiny flames that would eventually coalesce into a wildfire. And as the days crept closer to Christmas, the tension in the air thickened. Every step in the snow, every sound in the night, every movement of the family on the estate became part of a larger, invisible map, guiding the enslaved toward the moment when fear would turn to action and the chains that bound them could finally, even if only briefly, be broken. The days leading up to Christmas on the Virginia plantation carried an unsettling duality, a stark contrast between celebration and suppressed fury. Within the mansion, preparations for the holiday were in full swing. The family hung evergreen garlands along doorways, polished the silver until it gleamed like firelight, and arranged lavish feasts intended to display wealth and generosity. Laughter and music echoed through the halls, a manufactured warmth designed to mask the cold realities of the outside world. Servants scurried under orders, catering to every whim, while children of the family played obliviously, their joy echoing across the estate. The mansion was a carefully constructed theater, projecting comfort and security, yet it existed on the labor, suffering, and quiet despair of those who had no part in the festivities. Beyond the walls, the enslaved moved with practiced efficiency. Their labor did not cease even as the plantation buzzed with celebration. They prepared the fields, maintained the animals, and carried out the meticulous chores that ensured the house remained a portrait of order and wealth. But behind their outward compliance, minds were sharpening, plotting, and observing. Every conversation among the enslaved was laced with caution, every gesture carefully measured. Eyes flickered toward the mansion windows, noting the timing of each step, each movement of the family, each moment when security might lapse. These observations, once trivial, had become vital pieces of intelligence. The enslaved were no longer simply enduring. They were calculating, adapting, and preparing. The tension among them was palpable, a coiled spring of anticipation waiting for the moment to release. The preparation for rebellion had been slow and deliberate, shaped by years of oppression and sudden flashes of opportunity. The looming holiday, when the family would be distracted with feasting and celebration, created a unique window, a fleeting chance to challenge the order that had been enforced with so much cruelty. Within their cabins and hidden corners of the plantation, strategies were reviewed again and again. Escape routes were memorized, tools were repurposed as weapons, and alliances were solidified. It was a quiet storm, invisible to the masters, but growing steadily in intensity. Fear mingled with determination. Every enslaved individual knew the risks. Discovery meant brutal punishment, possibly death, not only for themselves, but potentially for their families and friends. And yet, the weight of oppression, the relentless dehumanization, and the memory of years spent in chains had cultivated a courage born of desperation. The very act of daring to plan was defiance, a statement that they were more than property, that their lives had intrinsic value. The balance between caution and audacity was delicate, but necessity dictated that risk must be embraced. Each individual understood that without bold action, freedom would remain a dream forever out of reach. Small moments of rebellion persisted even before the main act. A tool hidden under a floorboard, a whispered message passed under the guise of conversation, or a subtle alteration in routine, each became a rehearsal of sorts. The enslaved tested both their courage and the attentiveness of the overseers. These acts, though minor in isolation, were crucial training, both practical and psychological. They hardened minds against fear, built trust among the conspirators, and allowed them to imagine the impossible, a night where the plantation itself could be challenged, where those who had wielded power unchecked could feel vulnerability, if only for hours. Meanwhile, the family above remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering at their feet. The veneer of security seemed unshakable, reinforced by generations of entitlement and the assumption that control could never be threatened. They spoke of holiday traditions and past celebrations, ignorant of the silent plots unfolding in the very shadow of their wealth. This obliviousness, so characteristic of those who never questioned the morality of their world, only amplified the potential impact of the rebellion. The enslaved had learned to use invisibility as a weapon, to hide in plain sight, while preparing to overturn the balance of power that had long defined their existence. Every day, as the sun sank low and the chill of winter deepened, the contrast between mansion and field became more pronounced. The enslaved, weary yet vigilant, moved with precision, their thoughts consumed with strategy and timing. Meanwhile, laughter and music flowed from the mansion, each note a reminder of what had been stolen from them. The psychological tension was almost unbearable, the hope of freedom tempered by the constant awareness of danger. Yet within this tension lay clarity, a singular focus on the moment when the calm would break, when fear would become action, and when the oppressed could claim, even briefly, a sense of agency over their lives. As Christmas approached, the anticipation grew like a living thing, silent but insistent. Every whispered conversation, every careful observation, every measured step in the snow became part of a larger choreography, a prelude to the eruption that would shatter the plantation's delicate illusion of peace. The enslaved could feel the moment approaching, the tension coiling tighter with each passing day, until the night itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. It was a calm pregnant with inevitability, a deceptive stillness that masked the coming inferno. And it was in this fragile, tense quiet that courage, fear, strategy, and desperation converged, setting the stage for a Christmas rebellion that would sear itself into history, even as most would try to forget it. As the night of Christmas Eve fell over the plantation, a heavy silence blanketed the fields and cabins, broken only by the occasional crackle of fire in the hearths and the distant laughter from the mansion. For the enslaved, every sound, every shadow, and every flicker of light was a signal, a reminder that the time they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Months of careful observation, whispered planning, and coded exchanges had led to this single night, and the air seemed charged with a mix of fear, anticipation, and an almost electric determination. They moved through the darkness like ghosts, silent and deliberate, tools in hand, hearts pounding, ready to transform their whispered defiance into an eruption that would forever mark the estate. The first act of rebellion was simple but symbolic. Torches were lit, small fires carefully positioned near barns and fields, designed not only to sow panic but to signal coordination. Flames licked the edges of wooden structures, smoke curling upward into the starless sky. The smell of burning wood and straw mingled with the cold night air, a warning and a promise. As the fires grew, confusion spread among the overseers, who stumbled from their homes, whips raised, shouting orders into the dark. But the enslaved were no longer simply reacting. They were orchestrating chaos, each move part of a larger plan honed over months. The rebellion was both strategic and visceral, a calculated eruption of long-suppressed rage and courage. Inside the mansion, the family awoke to the first hints of disaster. Screams of animals fleeing the barns and shouts of alarm from the groundsmen shattered the illusion of safety. Panic rippled through the estate like a sudden storm. The enslaved, armed with tools repurposed as weapons, struck swiftly and decisively, targeting the most vulnerable points first. Doors were barricaded from the outside, windows shattered, and any attempt at organized resistance by the family was met with cunning and ferocity. The rebellion was not chaotic but choreographed, every action the result of careful observation of the family's habits and the weaknesses of the estate's defenses. Fear became a weapon as powerful as the tools in their hands. The sequence of events unfolded in terrifying clarity. Flames spread across the outer buildings, lighting the night sky and casting eerie shadows that danced like phantoms across the fields. The enslaved moved with purpose, their faces a mix of grim determination and uncontainable adrenaline. Confrontations erupted, sharp and brutal. Every movement was a life-or-death decision, every swing of a tool an act of liberation and defiance. The family, caught off guard, attempted to regain control, but the careful planning of the rebels rendered their efforts largely futile. By the time anyone could comprehend the scope of the attack, the estate had been transformed into a chaotic tableau of fire, fear, and the raw power of oppressed people claiming, even briefly, agency over their lives. The physical destruction was immense, but so too was the psychological impact. The mansion, which had stood for decades as a symbol of wealth and dominance, was now a place of terror. The fire's illuminated faces twisted in shock, panic, and fury, yet they also revealed courage and resourcefulness in those who had been forced to live in shadows. The enslaved had not only struck against their immediate oppressors, but had also sent a message to the wider community. Their humanity could not be denied, and the chains imposed upon them could be challenged. The symbolism of striking on Christmas Eve, when the family celebrated abundance and joy while others suffered in silence, was not lost on anyone. It was a night of reckoning, charged with poetic justice and raw emotional intensity. Amid the chaos, leadership and coordination became crucial. Certain figures emerged, guiding the actions of others, ensuring that the fires did not spread indiscriminately and that the most important objectives were achieved. They moved with a confidence born of careful planning and unwavering resolve, balancing destruction with the need to protect certain people and spaces. The enslaved operated as a network, each person aware of their role, their timing, and the signals that indicated when to act. The night became a symphony of rebellion, with each note, flames, screams, the crash of splintering wood, composed in perfect alignment with months of preparation. Despite the immediate success, the rebellion carried a heavy weight of fear. Every encounter with the family or overseers brought the possibility of death. Every blaze risked uncontrolled catastrophe. And yet the enslaved pressed forward, driven by the singular understanding that this night was a turning point. The sense of liberation, though fleeting, was intoxicating. For the first time, they were no longer invisible, no longer bound entirely by the rules of their oppressors. Each act of defiance, each strike against the estate, each torch set alight was a testament to resilience, courage, and the unyielding desire for freedom. By the time the first light of dawn threatened to break the spell of night, The plantation was unrecognizable. Smoke hung thick over the fields. The structures that had once symbolized control now charred and smoldering. The enslaved, though exhausted and wary of the inevitable reprisals, experienced a fleeting victory, a moment when the fear that had dominated their lives was supplanted, if only briefly, by agency and power. The Christmas rebellion had ignited not just buildings, but the imagination of all who witnessed it, a dramatic, horrifying, and unforgettable testament to the lengths to which humans would go to reclaim dignity in the face of unimaginable oppression. The glow of the fires had barely faded when the reality of retaliation began to descend on the plantation like a dark, unrelenting storm. The family and their allies, shocked and enraged, quickly gathered what forces they could to restore order. Panic, once confined to the brief moments of chaos, transformed into cold, methodical vengeance. The overseers, familiar with cruelty but now terrified by the audacity of the enslaved, organized searches, interrogations, and hunts that would leave no participant unaccounted for. Every shadow, every path through the woods, and every corner of the estate became a potential hiding place for those who had dared to strike, and every hiding place became a trap in the eyes of the enraged authorities. The rebels, who had moved with precision and courage during the night, now faced the stark and brutal consequences of their actions. Some had escaped into the woods, blending with the darkness, relying on memory, instinct, and the faint hope of sympathetic neighbors or distant networks of resistance. Others were captured almost immediately, dragged from the charred remains of barns and fields into chains that felt heavier than ever. Their courage, which had carried them through the rebellion, now collided with the terrifying reality of systemic cruelty. Punishments were swift, public, and intended to make an example of anyone who dared challenge the established order. Whippings, beatings, and in some cases executions were carried out with a merciless efficiency that left no room for mercy or negotiation. Even as the brutality unfolded, the psychological impact on both sides of the conflict was profound. The family, shaken to their core, realized that their power was not absolute, that the people they had considered property had demonstrated intellect, coordination, and a capacity for defiance that challenged centuries of unquestioned control. Fear mingled with guilt, and for some, an awareness that the veneer of civilization they clung to was more fragile than they had ever imagined. Meanwhile, the surviving enslaved, whether in hiding or under scrutiny, felt a mix of triumph and terror. They had claimed a moment of freedom, a fleeting taste of agency, but the reality of oppression was far from over. Every day that followed was shadowed by the possibility of discovery, betrayal, or renewed punishment. Historical records, biased and incomplete, often reduced the aftermath to numbers: how many were executed, how many fled, how much property was lost. They rarely captured the human complexity of the moment, the grief of those who had lost friends and family to the rebellion, the fear of those who remained, and the lingering pride in having dared to resist. The enslaved had challenged not just physical oppression, but the very idea that they were powerless, and that act, though punished, could never be erased entirely from memory. Even those who did not survive carried the symbolic weight of courage, a testament that human spirit cannot be entirely crushed, no matter the severity of retaliation. The violence of retribution was not only physical, but also psychological. Families were torn apart as authorities sought to root out the rebellion's network, and the mere suspicion of participation could bring punishment. The enslaved learned that silence, obedience, and patience were again necessary tools for survival. Yet the memory of the rebellion, of flames in the night, of coordinated defiance, lingered in their minds like an indelible mark. In secret, stories of courage and audacity were passed along, whispered in the fields, in the cabins, and in the woods. These stories, though dangerous to share, nurtured hope and preserved the memory of resistance, a quiet defiance that would endure long after the ashes had cooled. The immediate aftermath also exposed fractures and tensions within the enslaved community itself. Some questioned the wisdom of rebellion, fearing the repercussions, while others celebrated the courage displayed. Trust, carefully built during the planning and execution of the uprising, became fragile under the weight of punishment and surveillance. Allegiances were tested as authorities sought to extract names and confessions, forcing individuals to make impossible choices between self-preservation and loyalty to comrades. The rebellion had succeeded in asserting a moment of power, yet the cost was painfully evident. The oppressive machinery of the plantation, though temporarily challenged, remained brutally effective in asserting control. Even amid the horror of reprisals, subtle victories persisted. The rebellion had shattered illusions, proven that enslaved people were capable of strategy, coordination, and courage, and exposed vulnerabilities in a system that claimed absolute dominance. The family would rebuild, the fields would be replanted, and punishments would serve as warnings. But the psychological precedent had been set. Fear and awe now walked hand in hand. The enslaved had demonstrated that rebellion, however dangerous, was possible. It was a lesson carried in memory, whispered from generation to generation, that courage could ignite change, even in the face of overwhelming oppression. By the time the dust and smoke settled, the plantation bore the scars of both rebellion and retribution. Charred wood and flattened fences were reminders of the audacity that had challenged centuries of cruelty, and the cries and sobs of the punished lingered like a haunting refrain. The enslaved had paid dearly for their defiance, yet they had also claimed an undeniable truth. Their humanity, intellect, and courage could not be extinguished, even under the weight of chains and vengeance. The Christmas Rebellion would be remembered in whispers, shadows, and secret stories, a chilling and powerful testament to the resilience of those who refused to surrender completely to a system designed to erase them. The ashes of the estate smoldered long after the flames had been extinguished, but the memory of that night, that singular act of defiance, lingered in ways far more enduring than physical damage. The Christmas Rebellion did not simply vanish with the passing of months or the harsh reprisals exacted by the family and authorities. It remained alive in whispers, in the secret retelling of events, and in the silent defiance etched into the minds of the enslaved who survived. Though the rebellion was deliberately erased from official records or minimized in the accounts of the wealthy, it became a symbol, a testament to human courage and the unquenchable desire for freedom, even under the most brutal conditions. Its legacy was subtle but persistent, carried forward not in monuments or textbooks, but in memory, in culture, and in the courage of those who continued to resist oppression in quiet ways. Communities surrounding the plantation remembered the events differently than the family or the authorities did. To neighbors and fellow enslaved people, the rebellion was a story of audacity, a vivid example of what could be achieved when fear was transformed into action. Oral histories preserve the details, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes intimate, but always resonant with the power of human defiance. These narratives, passed through generations, offered more than mere recollections. They were warnings, lessons, and inspiration. They reminded those who would come after that courage could exist even in the darkest of circumstances, and that oppression could be challenged, if only with patience, cunning, and determination. Historians, when they eventually uncovered traces of the rebellion, were confronted with a puzzle. Why had such a bold, violent act been almost entirely erased from the official record? The answer lay in the deliberate control of narrative by the powerful, who sought to maintain the illusion of absolute authority and the unquestioned legitimacy of their social order. Acts of rebellion, particularly those led by enslaved people, threatened not only immediate stability, but also the foundational myths of colonial wealth and civility. By silencing the story, the family and the broader society attempted to erase the evidence of their vulnerability, denying the enslaved the historical recognition of their courage and intellect. Yet, even in erasure, the rebellion survived, like embers hidden beneath snow, waiting for those who would uncover its truth and understand its significance. The legacy of the Christmas Rebellion also reverberated in the psychology of resistance. Those who survived carried an awareness that oppression could be challenged, that careful planning and unity could yield moments of power. Even as fear dictated daily obedience, the knowledge of the night's events instilled a persistent, simmering confidence that authority could be confronted. Children who heard the stories of the rebellion grew up with the understanding that their worth was not measured solely by the labor extracted from them, but by the courage, intelligence, and spirit they possessed. This psychological inheritance, subtle but profound, shaped generations, nurturing resilience and the capacity for defiance even in contexts where open rebellion was impossible. Modern perspectives further illuminate the rebellion's significance. Scholars, activists, and storytellers recognize the night not only as an act of desperate defiance, but as a strategic assertion of agency in a world that sought to deny humanity. Its lessons extend beyond history, offering insight into the dynamics of power, resistance, and social memory. The rebellion exemplifies the intersection of courage and planning, of psychological fortitude and tactical intelligence, demonstrating that even in the most repressive circumstances, individuals can find ways to assert their autonomy. The story also serves as a critique of historical erasure, challenging contemporary audiences to question whose narratives are preserved, whose are silenced, and why. Emotionally, the legacy of the rebellion resonates because it embodies the contradictions of hope and horror, courage and tragedy. The enslaved who fought, survived, or perished were agents of change, yet their actions were constrained by an oppressive system that demanded obedience under threat of death. This tension between human aspiration and systemic cruelty is at the heart of the story's enduring power. The rebellion becomes more than an historical footnote. It is a meditation on resilience, a dramatic illustration of the lengths to which people will go to reclaim dignity, and a stark reminder of the consequences of systemic injustice. It asks the audience to bear witness, to feel the fear and bravery intertwined in every action, and to acknowledge the humanity that endured despite relentless oppression. Today, few monuments mark the plantation where the rebellion occurred, and many modern visitors remain unaware of its dark history. Yet its shadow endures, not in stone but in consciousness, in the recognition that ordinary people, denied basic rights, created extraordinary acts of resistance. The story challenges the sanitized narratives of history, revealing the complexity, pain, and courage that official records often obscure. It calls on modern observers to confront uncomfortable truths about power, memory, and justice, and to honor the lives of those who, in defiance of a world built to crush them, chose to fight, even if only for a night, to reclaim their humanity. The Christmas Rebellion's legacy is therefore both subtle and profound. It exists in whispers, in the stories passed across generations, and in the historical reckoning that attempts to reconstruct its truth. Its memory forces a confrontation with questions of morality, power, and the human capacity for courage. Though largely forgotten by mainstream history, its influence persists, echoing through the lives of those who continue to draw strength from acts of resistance against oppression. In this way, the rebellion, though violent and tragic, becomes immortal, not as a tale of vengeance alone, but as a testament to the enduring spirit of those who refuse to be silenced. The night of the Christmas Rebellion, with all its fire, chaos, and daring defiance, left a mark far deeper than the scars visible on the plantation grounds. Its significance extends beyond the immediate consequences of destruction and punishment. It serves as a mirror reflecting the complexities of human courage, morality, and the struggle for freedom under the most oppressive circumstances. For those who consider history merely as a series of dates, names, and numbers, the rebellion may appear as an isolated act of violence. Yet for those who delve into the emotional and psychological layers of the event, it emerges as a profoundly human story, a tale of people pushed to the brink, yet refusing to surrender their dignity or their hope for liberation. The rebellion challenges us to confront uncomfortable truths about the past and to acknowledge the courage of those whose voices were deliberately silenced. In reflecting upon the rebellion, one is struck by the duality of its legacy. On one hand, it was a night of tremendous destruction and chaos. Buildings were burned, lives were imperiled, and families experienced profound trauma. On the other hand, it was an assertion of autonomy and agency, a dramatic reminder that even under systems designed to strip individuals of power, human ingenuity and courage can find expression. The enslaved fighters acted with strategy, intelligence, and deliberate purpose. Their actions were not random. They were a calculated response to years of oppression, humiliation, and suffering. In this sense, the rebellion was both a moral statement and a tactical achievement, a desperate yet meticulously planned act of defiance that demanded acknowledgement, even centuries later. The rebellion also offers critical insight into the psychology of resistance. It reveals how people under extreme oppression can cultivate hope, plan strategically, and execute acts that defy expectation. The enslaved had been trained to obey, to internalize fear, and to accept punishment without question. Yet, the very conditions intended to suppress them became catalysts for ingenuity. They observed, adapted, and exploited the smallest opportunities for leverage. Every glance, every whispered signal, and every memorized routine was part of a larger, intelligent scheme. This demonstrates a remarkable resilience of the human mind, showing that even when physically constrained, people can assert mental and moral autonomy. Another profound lesson lies in the importance of memory and historical recognition. The rebellion was deliberately erased from official records, minimized by those in power to maintain the illusion of control and the narrative of an unquestionable social order. Yet, despite attempts at erasure, its memory survived in whispers, oral traditions, and cultural memory among enslaved communities. This demonstrates that even the most powerful systems of oppression cannot fully eliminate truth. Stories, particularly those carried in the hearts and minds of witnesses, hold a power that official documents and historical records often cannot suppress. The Christmas Rebellion teaches us that history is not only written by the powerful, but also remembered by the oppressed, even when hidden in shadow and silence. The rebellion invites reflection on moral complexity as well. While modern audiences may recoil at the violence unleashed that night, it is crucial to understand the context in which it occurred. The rebellion was born from centuries of systemic cruelty, deprivation, and dehumanization. Its participants were responding not merely to an immediate injustice, but to a lifetime of oppression. Recognizing this does not glorify violence, but it does demand empathy, contextual understanding, and acknowledgement of the impossible choices faced by those who resist tyranny. The moral lesson is that courage often emerges from necessity, and that acts of defiance against entrenched injustice may appear shocking precisely because they challenge the comfortable narratives of history. This reflection also extends to contemporary understanding of justice, power, and memory. The rebellion serves as a reminder that oppression thrives not only through physical control, but also through the manipulation of narrative and collective memory. The silencing of the enslaved fighters' stories reflects a broader societal tendency to prioritize the perspectives of the powerful while marginalizing those who resisted. Today, revisiting these events allows modern audiences to confront the selective preservation of history, to question whose stories are told, and to honor those whose courage was rendered invisible for centuries. In doing so, we acknowledge the humanity, intelligence, and resilience of those who dared to challenge tyranny. Emotionally, the rebellion leaves a haunting resonance. Its participants were both heroic and tragic, courageous in their planning and execution, yet vulnerable to the harsh realities of retaliation. They demonstrated that human dignity cannot be entirely suppressed, even under unimaginable oppression. Their story challenges us to reflect not only on the cruelty of the past, but also on the enduring capacity for resilience, ingenuity, and moral courage. It compels audiences to feel the fear, hope, and determination intertwined in the narrative, to witness the tension between human aspiration and systemic cruelty, and to recognize that acts of defiance, even when punished, leave indelible marks on the collective memory of humanity. Ultimately, the Forgotten Christmas Rebellion is not merely a historical incident. It is a meditation on resilience, morality, and the unyielding desire for freedom. It reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, humans possess the capacity to resist, to strategize, and to assert their worth. The story challenges complacency, provokes reflection, and honors those who, in the shadow of oppression, dared to dream, plan, and act. Though largely erased from official history, its lessons endure. Courage may be punished, but it cannot be destroyed, and the human spirit, even when silenced, continues to assert itself in whispers, memory, and legacy. The rebellion's story, though centuries old, continues to echo, compelling us to bear witness, remember, and learn from the extraordinary acts of those who refused to surrender their humanity.